What I'm going to do is attempt to use a cost-benefit approach to draw some simple connections between what at first sight are some very different and wide-ranging subjects. They include collective responsibility for climate issues and carbon budgets, environment and health, carbon capture, and economic development, and the value that is placed on the time of women. First of all, let's just remind ourselves of the concept of the carbon budget. This is actually rather a dated 2-degree target chart, but the main point of it is still true. There's very little headroom left if we want to meet our climate targets. Failure to meet those targets means either we have to suffer the consequences or we have to pay to remove the CO2 retrospectively. Essentially, that will mean carbon capture, including direct carbon capture from the atmosphere. In principle, the technology is there, but we know it has a very high cost. That's currently estimated at around $600 a ton. Some of the firms claim that that could be reduced to about $100, and I think perhaps if we said 200, that might be a more realistic but still optimistic number. But one of the questions I'm going to ask is whether that is a number that we should be pricing in to climate policies. But before we do that, let's go back to national responsibilities by country. And we can look at that either as cumulative emissions since pre-industrial times, around 1750, or we can look at current annual rates. But whichever way we look at it, it's clear that the biggest responsibility is going to lie with larger and higher income countries. Those include particularly Europe, the USA, Japan, other G7 countries, and probably China and a few others. If we look at the same information in per capita terms, again, the same story emerges, and it's quite clear that the wealthier countries, the highest emitters per capita, have a lot of work to do at home. But we can't ignore some of the low emission countries further down. One of the reasons is that collectively they have large populations and high economic growth rates. So this chart is not the whole story. One of the reasons for this is firewood, the use of firewood and charcoal for cooking. Firewood is usually collected using the labor of women and sometimes children. It's hard work, it's unpaid, and it's not usually included in the national statistics that I showed you earlier. But it's a big source of carbon emissions, and it matters. We sometimes think of wood burning as a nice, environmentally friendly alternative. But that's only true, if it's true at all, if that's a sustainable use of wood. But in much of the world, it's associated with deforestation, which in turn has severe consequences. It can also be associated with poor health and respiratory disease. Now, there are solutions using today's technology. Let's try to look at some of the numbers. Wood for cooking is often estimated, or usually estimated, at about 400 kilograms per person per year. That equates to about 3/4 of a ton of CO2. And that could be replaced by LPG, or even better, it could be replaced by renewable electricity, about 500 kilowatt hours a year. Now, if we turn to the cost-benefit analysis of what results from that replacement, then we can say that The World Bank estimates that the cost of rural renewable electricity could be brought down to about 22 cents per kilowatt hour. So that would be the cost on one side. Now, not having to extract CO2 from the atmosphere in due course, and if we fail to meet our targets, not having to extract that CO2 could value those kilowatt hours at up to 30 cents per kilowatt hour. In addition, there are a lot of other health, environment, and economic benefits that come from that, which I have not yet tried to put into the equation. Now, of course, there are a lot of practicalities involved in this. Getting the average cost down to 22 cents a kilowatt hour is not a trivial exercise. Among other things, it will depend on establishing other productive uses of electricity in developing countries. That's essential to build sufficient scale. It will depend on reducing procurement and installation costs. We need to make sure that the electricity can be made affordable to local communities. And of course, we have to organize donor or other financing. But from a global perspective, it's quite clear that this is something that needs to happen. At about 2 to 3% of global emissions, this is an issue that is on the same scale as aviation, about which we usually hear a lot more. Now, what I've told you today, of course, has all been about orders of magnitude, and I have to admit I have made some heroic assumptions. But I suggest that we can reach the following conclusions quite easily. The first is that renewable rural electricity looks like a good bargain to prioritize for an aid budget. And the second is that this is really only going to be practical within the context of much wider success in promoting economic development and poverty reduction. Thank you very much. If you want to read more on these and other issues, do please go to my blog. Thank you.